I'm Craig Cipolla. I'm the curator of North American archaeology at the ROM, and I'm delighted you could join us for today's curator conversation. It's a new digital program that we offer that explores themes and subjects of the ROM collections and research.
And my name is Justin Jennings, the curator of Latin American archaeology. I'm also delighted to be with you today.
We'd like to begin, before we get any further, by acknowledging that the ROM sits on what has been the ancestral land of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Anishinaabe Nation, including the Mississauga of the Credit River, since time immemorial to today.
And we're pleased to be here in advance of International Archaeology Day, for all those that may know that, October 17th. So it's a great moment to sort of talk about some of the issues about why archaeology matters in anticipation of that day, where a lot of organizations will talk about the archaeology being done both here in Canada and throughout the world. And just a note that we're live right now, but what you're going to be seeing momentarily is a recorded conversation between Craig and I about why archaeology matters.
Hi, everybody. We're here to talk about why archaeology matters today. In 2020, when we have pandemics and ecological crises, what does archaeology have to say about the problems that we face in 2020? And so what we're going to do today is talk about four main issues. And I think the first thing that jumps to mind, a pretty obvious one to start with, is pandemics and COVID-19, right? So for me, when I think of something like pandemics or COVID-19, the first thing that jumps to mind, sort of archaeologically speaking, is how humans innovate new things in these challenging times. So for instance, I think when you look at things archaeologically speaking, you can see human creativity, you can see also non-Western approaches to science and health. So for instance, Ojibwe scholar Brenda Childs recently traced the origin of a certain dance called the jingle dance in indigenous North America to our last pandemic, to the Spanish flu of 1918. And the jingle dance is this important indigenous dance you find all across North America today. It's known for this special dress that has these tiny metallic cones, hundreds of them. And so when you dance, as the name implies, it creates this jingling noise. And so this was this Ojibwe response to the uncertainty of these times, which is really interesting. Now, what archaeologists can do is they can trace the history of these innovations. And when we look at this, we can actually find that jingle cones are seen throughout the archaeological record before we have a jingle dance, for at least 500 years before that pandemic hit, right? So these little cones that we find are usually made of European-made sheet copper or sheet brass. And interestingly enough, right now modern medicine is using copper for healing purposes. It has this free electron that attacks things like bacteria or germs. It's even been tested on COVID-19, and it does kill COVID-19. And hospitals are using it for doorknobs and things. So you can see all kinds of things with human innovation and the long-term history. What do you actually think about when you think about pandemics in archaeology, Justin?
Well, when I think about pandemics, Greg, I tend to think of that over the last 20,000 years, we've been in one pandemic. I tend to sort of think that we had this episode of COVID, you talked about the Spanish flu, that over and over again, we've just had these moments that have overwhelmed us. But really, ever since the end of the last ice age, as we have settled down more and more often in bigger groups over longer periods of time, what happens? So you sit there, you're with pigs, with cows, et cetera, in the same place. You're eating together, doing all sorts of things. You have these diseases spreading back and forth. So really, if you look at it through that long lens of archaeology, what you're seeing are these moments, time and time again, of disease spreading, cholera, typhus, smallpox, et cetera. So for example, the first cities, once again, these big incubators of disease. So as we begin to do new things and innovate and create these wonders of technology, et cetera, we're also creating these really fertile moments of spread for epidemics. And so, so for example, all the way up until the 18th century, we would see things like in London, routinely 10% of the population would get felled by something like cholera, right? That in a way, is that we've gotten sort of used to this moment of where we seem to be relatively disease-free. Oh, we've beaten history. We've beaten the 20,000-year pandemic. But no, it's a little blip. And now we had cities, now we have globalization that begins to connect us and drive this stuff forward. So from an archaeological perspective, I think in some ways, in some ways it's perhaps not great to think about, oh yeah, we've been living under this pandemic, but the point is, yeah, we've been living, we've been doing well, that we'll get through this just as we've gotten through many, many pandemics before. So that would be what I would draw, about COVID from archaeology. Let's flip over to another topic, and that would be climate change. Of course, we're seeing all these wildfires in different places, heat, cold, et cetera. What are your thoughts about what archaeology can tell us about climate change?
Yeah, I mean, you brought up the forest fires on the West Coast, which we are really seeing a lot of in the last few weeks. And so that really brings to mind some recent archaeological research that looks at the deep history of indigenous hunter-gatherers on the West Coast in places like California. Now, there's archaeologists out there in California on the West Coast working with indigenous communities, working with ecologists, and they're using archaeology to learn about the histories of different human ecosystems, the long-term histories. And they call this restorative ecology. They found that hunter-gatherers for thousands of years used controlled burning. And what that did was it increased biodiversity in those forests, but more importantly for the forest fires, it kept fuel loads very low. Now, these hunting and gathering practices were interrupted with colonialism, and because of these practices were stopped, it makes parts of the West Coast, and California in particular, more susceptible to these giant forest fires that we see in the news. So not only does archaeology reveal possible ways to actually address this problem, right, with restorative ecology, but it also gives us insights into what the impacts of colonialism, and actually gives us insights into other ways of relating to the world that are sort of foreign to us, like hunter-gatherers, because we're capitalists now, right? What are your thoughts about sort of how archaeologists might contribute to some of these debates having to do with climate change?
Yeah, when I think about climate change, I think a lot about infrastructure, especially where I work in the Andes. And looking in, for example, in first millennium AD, early second millennium AD, in places like the north coast of Peru, where they would be hit routinely with great climatic fluctuations. Sand dunes moving in, they'd have the El Nino phenomenon hitting back and forth. And so the sense was, okay, how do you possibly survive in a place like this? How do you survive in a time when there's lots of things happening climatically all the time you have to be prepared for? And what they did, and what I think is useful for us thinking about these things today, is they built an infrastructure that was based on making the best out of all these fluctuations. So for example, you had these field systems that would only really work if you had an El Nino year. So the El Nino year is when you have torrential rains. So usually it's very dry on the north coast, you'd have big rains. And these fields and these field systems, the canals, et cetera, would only really work during these times. And so you'd have a year or two that you'd be able to use these fields that you would maintain that were usually not used, and then be able to take that same time and fix up all the infrastructure that had been destroyed by those torrential rains. So by creating this really robust structure to deal with these fluctuations, people in North Coast were able to survive for for thousands of years in this location. And this is what I often see for climate change today. People look at something and say, oh yeah, we're going to build this so that it sustains the worst winds in the decade, or the worst drought we've had over the last 20 years. And that nowadays isn't cutting it. And so what I think we can really learn from archaeology is examples like the North Coast. We had these people living in these environments that were very close to the environment and all of its, and all of what Mother Nature can do. And they found a way to live. And I think we can build off that to build a sort of a more robust society moving forward in this era of increasing climate change. So COVID, climate change. Now let's hit technological dependency.
Sure.
So, Craig, what are your thoughts on that?
So actually, that makes me think of smartphones, of course, because within our generation, of course, we started using smartphones, at least I have. And I always think about all the great things that smartphones allow us to do, but also really think about all these dependencies that they create. For instance, I can't remember anyone's phone number. I don't know your phone number, Justin. I don't know many of my relatives' phone numbers anymore. In fact, I'm new to Toronto. Well, relatively new. I've been here about 5 years. I probably can't find anywhere if I didn't have my smartphone to get around in Toronto. So I'm really interested in looking at how new technologies create these dependencies and create these unintended consequences, and look at the long-term outcomes of those technological adaptations. Now, archaeology is really good at this, as you know, with the long-term perspective on these types of change. For instance, here in Ontario, if we look at the colonial fur trade or something, in fact, we could look at this all over North America. We look at the introduction of new European-made technologies like firearms, like guns. There's something even simpler than that, like steel knives, right? And we have plenty of examples of that here in the ROM, in our own collections. Now, these obviously replaced other types of technology. They came to compete with things like stone tool production. But as they did this within a generation or two, it creates this relationship of dependency, both on Euro-colonial peoples, but also on Euro-colonial technologies. So within a generation, it's very hard to go back and remember how to make stone tools again and to be self-sufficient like all indigenous peoples were before Europeans came. Within a generation, they became very much dependent on these new people that were in the area. So when we think about technology, I think about those smartphones and how they relate to something like a trade item in the colonial era. What do you think about when you think about technology?
Yeah, you know, this is where I think our thoughts are aligning a fair amount, because I'm also thinking about sort of this dependency, and in this case, thinking about what archaeologists sometimes call tethering. And that's sort of the sense of you getting stuck. I know you talked a little bit, this sort of stuck or entangled with these objects that you may have made and not really thought about too much, and then suddenly you're sort of living with them for years and transforming everything around you. So I think, once again, think about stone tools, some of the first stone tools, that were being made to take down some of the megafauna. That suddenly you're becoming dependent on this megafauna, but then also dependent on those lithic, on those stone sources to make those stone tools. So you change the way that you interact with each other. You change where you put your camps every day. You change how you're going to speak to the people down the line in terms of getting some of the quality stone to make those great tools. So over time, you just get stuck because of a decision that you made. You probably weren't even thinking about that. Same sort of thing, give another example, when you begin to depend on agriculture. And you've got these great big grinding stones. Those grinding stones, something you can go ahead and you can get a lot out of your environment suddenly. You can get a lot of those seeds, and you can live in a place for much longer than you could before. But then you get stuck with that stone. You can't carry it around anymore. I got a hernia once trying to carry one of those big grinding stones. It stays in one place. And so once again, you get tethered. Now tethered even more closely to a location. You get stuck in one place, and then when I talked about earlier, you get hit with you got the animals now, you got the diseases now, you've got all sorts of issues that you weren't thinking about. And let me go back finally to my cell phone, because I was one of those late adapters of cell phone. Of course, it was like, only for emergencies. For those people that remember that era, that's why I'm getting it. I'm not going to use it anytime else. Yep. And suddenly you're using it all the time, right? You got stuck with it. You innovate on that technology, but you go down that rutted path. And that's where I think is interesting for us. As archaeologists, people are excited. Wow, look at what the iPhone's doing to us. Look at what Facebook is doing us. And as archaeologists, we often say, well, of course. That's what every technology always does to you. So what you need to do then is think about that as you begin to adapt these a little bit more. Think a little bit more about what Facebook will do. Think about what the next technology will do, because you know it's going to happen, because it always happens. And that's what I think, once again, that's what archaeology gives us that great perspective on. Okay, so finally, we got COVID, climate change, technological dependency, and the other issue that's out there right now, monuments and protest movements. What does archaeology say about that?
Sure. As an Italian American who studies the archaeology of colonialism in America, I think this is an appropriate topic. This really closely aligns with my own research. And of course, what I'm talking about is all the recent topplings of colonial monuments, specifically many monuments depicting Christopher Columbus, right? So I think there's a couple things to talk about here, right? I think first of all, again, archaeology really excels at showing what histories came before those monuments were put up, right? So here in North America, we can look at thousands of years of indigenous history. We can look at thousands of years, or at least hundreds and hundreds of years, of major modifications to the land that were introduced by indigenous peoples. An example of that would be looking at these major mound complexes all over parts of North America. So first of all, we can look at, there's a history before those monuments go up, and we can document that history. Second, I think archaeologists are really good at finding when monuments come down, right? So the future archaeologists will be able to see something special is going on in 2020 when all these colonial monuments are either they're disappeared or they're modified or defaced in some way. This is really important to remember because I think some people out there get really upset because they think of taking down a monument or changing a monument as if it erases everything. Right? It erases those people from history. It erases the fact that the monument was there for maybe 100 years, but in fact it doesn't. People always leave traces for historians and archaeologists like us to find. And so I like to think of our job as partially helping our societies remember. We can remember when the monuments were put up and what histories they overwrote in some ways in a colonial setting, but we can always also remember, very important, when they came down and why they came down, and document that the tensions that were part of that. So that's what I think, how it relates to my own work. But what do you think, right? What do you think about your own work and how it relates to monuments and times of protest?
Yeah, when I think about this, certainly, as you're talking about the colonial monuments coming down, the history is literally littered with thousands of Egyptian or Peruvian, whatever monuments that have been toppled in protest movements. Roman, great rebellions, etc. Sure. But what I also sort of get from the past are alternative pathways to protest that oftentimes in the short term feel like they're not working sometimes. And maybe some examples of how you can pair some of these protests together, perhaps in an effective way. And so my mind wanders off all the way to the 3rd millennium BC, thinking about Harappa, so Indus Valley Civilization, Pakistan, present-day Pakistan, and parts of India. And the Indus Valley Civilization is interesting because it's well known for there's not a lot of evidence for sort of kings and great leaders and big palace complex, et cetera. There's not evidence for a lot of violence. But it was a huge city, huge technological virtuosos, et cetera, that was happening in this place. But I mention it here because when you look at a place like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, et cetera, what you see is that the cities are organized not around class, but around sort of kinship and around these sort of almost like villages that are packed together to form a city. And what we see as we look through some of that research is realize that there's a lot of tension there between folks that are trying to sort of create a class-based society and folks that are trying to maintain a more kin-based society. But they manage to sort of navigate through this over hundreds of years without having that violence, without seeing that sort of the monuments being toppled, without seeing a lot of the chaos that you often see in a lot of other cultures. And what you tend to see is that you see sort of people working together as groups, oftentimes pushing. So for example, as people begin to do outward displays of class and jewelry, et cetera, there's a counter movement, it seems, to push against that. Later on, as you start, at the very end, you start seeing these great halls and great bathhouses, which seems to be a moment that you have these elites trying to create this new kind of society, and people push back against that. It's hard to see. It's not there in the same way as you see that that broken off, toppled statue thrown into the ground. But what we do see is we see the power sort of this incremental, kin-based, group-based, nonviolent protest that's moving against something that people thought was fundamentally wrong, and they're able to stop that time and time again from happening. So I do think what's interesting to me is that you can find all sorts of ways to protest and look at the efficacy in the past that maybe oftentimes at the moment you say, hey, I'm not sure if this is working. Well, we can look and see how different things worked and how things may have not worked. So I think that's it. I think we covered a lot of issues we could go on, but I think the point that we're trying to make here is that you know, the past matters. And the past matters not simply, say, 100 years or even 200 years, but the past matters 5,000, 6,000 years as well, so that we can look at some of what archaeology can give us and begin to understand our present a little bit better, and also maybe tackle the future and try to make a better future for ourselves from the lessons that we can learn from all those that have come before us.
Absolutely, I totally agree.
So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hello. Thanks very much for joining us for the program. And I think Justin and I are now going to spend a few minutes trying to address some of your questions. And I think Justin will lead off with a question. It's his job to pick the first one, I think.
Sure. So I've got a couple of general questions, but I'll start with one here that's just about the skills. How does one, basically, what are the skills that one needs to develop a career in archaeology? And how can you go about developing those skills?
Okay, sure. Well, I think there's all different types of pathways you can take to becoming a professional archaeologist. Most all of them these days require a minimum of a bachelor's degree, but sometimes even a master's degree. Usually, most curators at the ROM being hired nowadays have a PhD as well. So, but before you even get to that stage, I think what you really want to test out, even before you take any classes, my recommendation would be to get outside and try to experience what archaeology is like, or to go into a laboratory, maybe volunteer in an archaeological laboratory and get some experience, because it's not as romantic, it's not as great as all those romanticized versions you get on television. I absolutely love doing archaeology. I eat it, I breathe it, I sleep it. I love doing field archaeology. I love doing lab work, but that's certainly not the case for all archaeologists. So the first thing you want to do is sort of volunteer and get some experience to see if that's really something you want to pursue further. Justin, do you have any advice that you'd want to add in there? And by the way, I should say before I pass it over, don't forget to put your questions in that Q&A section. Not you, Justin, but everybody else.
Yeah, no, I'm looking at the chat as well here that was just sent to us. Yeah, I mean, that's basically it, Craig. There's not much to add there. I mean, it's you know, what I'm also hoping, you know, that we're showing people in this session today is that, you know, you can look at the past and be fascinated, passionate about the past without leaving the present, or, you know, or trying to create a better future. So one I think the great challenge that we have in archaeology is really to show that relevance, right? You know, that, so we're not speaking just to each other, so that, you know, we encourage all sorts of people to get into this field and don't feel as if, you know, once again, that you're leaving behind, you know, the real world. No, I mean, what we're doing is using, you know, 20,000, 200,000 years of the real world to understand our world better today.
Okay. So here's a question that speaks directly to some of the topics that we were talking about. One person says that they know climate change is destroying lots of archaeological sites. What do you think the best solution is to this problem? Do you think it's better to try and move parts of the site to safety, or record the site as best you can before it disappears? You want to try to take a stab at that one?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you know, unfortunately, it's a matter. I mean, the answer is like a lot of things in life, both. You know, there are, you know, huge amounts of coastal sites, of course, that are in great jeopardy. Lots of sites we don't know about, and you know, just even before we've talked about climate change, we know that things like agriculture, you know, industrial agriculture destroyed far more sites than looting, for example. And now the same thing, that climate change is sort of this hidden killer, you know, one you don't really think about. You like to think about, you know, folk going in and digging up a tomb at night or something. But what we are getting, yeah, we're getting those sites. And what's, I think, important to me is that, of course, it's a whole question, you know, great questions, for example, about the people in the Americas. Are we going to lose a lot of those answers because of climate change and the destruction of sites? So, I would think that you're going to see a combination. That there are certain sites that people have found that are important, that they're going to go ahead and try to invest in and maybe move to another location. But for the most part, I think what you're going to see a lot of, and hopefully we do more of, is a lot of salvage archaeology, is really putting in the work, trying to, and this is where I think a lot of, folks that might be more involved with cultural resource management is use a lot of those skills. You know, that what's so great about CRM is they learn how to dig very well and very quickly. Far better at that than archaeologists in dealing with these issues of climate change. A lot of those techniques. So I think we've got to do a lot of salvage work, and I think we've got to learn how to do it in a way that's fairly cost effective and fairly quick, because yeah, it is a very pressing need.
Yeah, I mean, I think well, the best solution would be to stop the climate change. I guess we could start there. But yeah, to be realistic, I think Justin's absolutely right. There's going to be a whole lot of so-called salvage archaeology. He talked about CRM, which just means cultural resource management. These are the professional firms that come in and do surveys. The other thing that we, of course, always deal with, especially in places like here in Toronto, is human developments, right? So when new buildings go in, when new Walmarts or something are built, you have to do an archaeological survey to check for if there's any archaeological sites there, and sometimes have to move them. So that's another competing factor that always is going to threaten archaeological resources. And so that's another main area where archaeologists find employment. By the way, most archaeologists in the world, practicing archaeologists, aren't at the ROM. They're doing contract work, like CRM work, like Justin referenced. Do we have another one, Justin?
Yeah, we have a number of questions. I'll apologize in advance. We've got more questions than we can possibly answer. But let me choose one here that, especially with the presidential debates in the U.S. Going on. But how might archaeology inform us about the future of the U.S. given the current chaotic political situation? So, Craig, any thoughts about that?
Wow. Okay. That's a tough one to take on in a webinar for the general public. I think Justin kind of hit upon some of this. He was kind of touching upon some of it in his video part, meaning that I guess archaeology does look at the long-term history of human conflicts. And of course, the U.S. right now in 2020 is not the first place to ever have human conflict, but it might be the first to have this type of conflict. Of course, one of the main reasons behind some of these conflicts, in my understanding, is the technologies that we have and the so-called circulation of fake news and rhetoric. So it might be sort of unprecedented in that way. I don't know in this webinar format if I can give you any great answer to your question, but I would suggest that if an archaeologist were to sit down and start thinking about it a little bit more, we might be able to come up with some creative solutions by looking at the past and trying to come up with some ideas. But I think looking at the way that social media works to circulate information, I think we could actually look at some other similar patterns in the past for how that sort of changes people's opinion about the world and influences people. And that might be a way to think about how we relate to Facebook and things like that. I know it's not a great answer to your question, but I think that's what I'm going to offer right now. Justin, what do you think?
Yeah, the only thing I guess I would add to that when you look back in time, that there's lots of conflict, lots of what I mean internal conflict, and not just simply goes to rebellion and strife and other things like that, but that a lot of times it's baked into these societies, right? That there are, upper and lower, left and right divisions, that oftentimes the people get engaged things in mock battle or singing contests or other sorts of things. So what I'm particularly interested in is this sort of sense is that the conflict you're seeing, not just in the United States, other places, increasing polarization, right? Increasing antagonism. We do see ways in the past where people have built societies upon that and then found ways to better negotiate. Because I think the issue that I see in the States and other places is that there's a lot of that, and then there's not mechanisms to really bridge those gaps because people don't know how to bridge them. They just see them going further and further. So what I do think, so whether or not we want to have singing contest or mock battle, all those are super cool ideas. But I do think that you could think about some of the ways, because what I have generally found is that today people sort of see conflict as being sort of abnormal, where in many places it was the norm, and that's how society was built, through that tension. And so maybe looking at some of those examples might guide us.
Okay, sounds good. Here's a good question for us that we could both probably answer. So archaeology offers fantastic insights into pre-colonial cultures across the globe. what potential insights and educational possibilities do you see that archaeology could offer to contemporary cultures who are experiencing the negative results of colonialism?
Yeah, you got this. These are tough questions, man. Yeah. So I think what of course we do have is colonialism. Of course, did not begin with Europe. Is that there are centuries of colonialism in different forms. Now, in many cases, as people have rightfully noted, that European colonialism in many ways may be distinct from these, but not in all cases. Certainly there were some cases, for example, Roman colonialism that's often mentioned, where the way in which the Gauls were treated might be somewhat similar. So there are sort of times where you can go ahead and say that we might be able to gain some insights there. And what you do often see over time, and what you're seeing in Europe, in our era as well, is that you do go from a moment where, if you look, for example, the first 100 years or so, there's a sense of, you're either Roman or you're not. If you're not, you're below us and you don't matter. To coming up with more notions where you're saying, okay, that we're going to expand the notion of Romanness, expand the notion of who we are, and begin to navigate through that. So to me, what I think what we can learn from the past is looking at some of those longer term colonial moments where you have people that are in locations 300, 400 years, and how they began to navigate these differences. For me, I think, without getting into too much specifics for the lack of time, I think that's where we can go ahead and look at these. Yes, it's a very different sense for a number of reasons, but I do think there might be some nuggets there to try to sort of find a way forward in this sort of era of reconciliation, decolonization, et cetera.
Well, one of the things I think of with that question is, of course, like different types of environmental archaeology where we're sampling for plant remains, animal remains, things like this. Specifically as it relates to sort of different types of food practices. So gathering food, how food was gathered, how food was prepared. Sometimes you look at ceramics, you can do a scrape on ceramics, you can look at what things were in that pot. And I think that's a useful thing to many communities to learn about how in the deep past, their ancestors were feeding themselves and how they were preparing food and things like that. So I think that's a useful thing, and also sort of broader ecological relations, like even some of the hunter-gatherer relations I talked about in the video. I think sometimes that archaeology does add new information that the contemporary community doesn't have. And so they might learn new things from doing their own archaeology, learning about how they related to the environment, how they went out into the environment, used certain types of plants or animals, and how they prepared food is one example that I can think of immediately. But I think in general, archaeology is very good at addressing these things that we don't think critically about in our everyday lives. So we can look at how people made stone tools, and that's a useful thing to share that information with people that might not make their stone tools anymore. So just sort of adding questions about what things look like is a useful thing that archaeologists can always contribute, I think, to any time period.
Okay, Craig. So I'm thank you. Yeah. So I'm looking. I'm looking through the questions and trying to integrate it, because a few of them go on similar things, and I think a few of the attendees mentioned this sort of the need to bridge sort of archaeological practice and indigenous knowledge. So we didn't talk too much about that today, but certainly you've done a little bit about. So I think the interest is, well, how do we actually make those connections? How do we begin to bring in some of this indigenous knowledge or elder knowledge into the ways in which we do archaeology today?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this is kind of the work that I do. So I should say that I work with most of the research I do in the field, and a lot of it that I do in like archaeological laboratories is done in partnership with Native American groups in America or First Nation groups here in Ontario. And so the long-term project I've been doing, I've been working with a group in Connecticut called the Mohegan Tribe, where we do archaeology together each summer. We work closely with elders. So we talk to elders about their knowledge of that landscape. Now, that could be the knowledge that they've accrued during their lifetime. They might be 80 years old. They might be 90 years old. And they might tell us all the stories of that place that they've always lived. And so they can tell you those micro histories that they've experienced, but they can also pass on the stories that their grandparents told them and the grandparents told their grandparents, right? So we have that information coming to us as we're physically doing archaeology in the woods in Connecticut, where we work every summer. And so we can sort of compare what we're digging with that knowledge, and actually sometimes obviously use those two things to get a richer understanding of what the past might have been like, especially for us, because we're studying really the 1700s, the 1800s, really. So it's quite a useful way of using indigenous knowledge. And of course, specialized indigenous knowledge about the use of plants in particular is really useful, because it helps us kind of explain some of the plant remains that we might find. Oh, they actually know about this. They know that their grandparents used this, their great-great-grandparents used this. And so that's really always interesting when you find a nice correlation between the archaeology and the oral history and the oral tradition.
And, just to add to that, it's interesting because Craig, as he said, he works with, in the Mohican fairly late in terms of 1700s, et cetera. I'm working in the Andes in Peru, looking at material 700, 800 AD. So not super early, but a fair amount earlier. And of course, the other context, which is big, is just the Columbian encounter and just the massive deaths that resulted from them, the massive migrations that developed from that. So there's that people want to say, well, so there's a sense of community, there's a sense of descent there that in the Mohican that we don't have in the Andes. And so that changes how you go ahead and interact with folks. We certainly work, I've worked for 20 years with the same Peruvian. We've got a lot of Peruvians on our project. They're certainly involved in that project, but they oftentimes think of it as Peruvian history, not necessarily Mohican history or their history in the same way, right? So it's a different sort of sense. So that's why, in some ways, it's interesting that a lot of these conversations, that yes, we want to get a lot of those different viewpoints involved, but of course, how that plays out, I find, is very different from location to location because of those individual histories and the players that are involved with them.
Yeah, and the example that I talked about in the video speaks to that as well, because we talked about the jingle dance, which all indigenous people know about in North America right now. But of course, many indigenous people I talk to actually don't know about the archaeology, where you have these cones in the ground that you find for about 500 or more years, which is really interesting. So again, that's an example where you put those two forms of knowledge together and you get something that's greater than the sum of the parts. Now, I found a question here that really relates to the theme of the topic. It says, do you think that archaeology will change, or has it changed because of this pandemic, COVID-19 right now?
It's hard though. Certainly it's changed. Certainly it's changing for the short term, and that's fairly easy. For example, I've got a project that I'm doing with my same co-director, Willie Yepes, and he's supposed to be going up there in November. So I'm part of a project where I'm going to be enjoying it virtually for the first time. So from the short-term perspective, yeah, a lot has changed. That there's some local field work being done. But I do think what the little work that's been coming out of late that's talked about this is suggesting that what we might be doing is trying to do less travel, less maybe that involves doing field work in different ways, or working, collaborating in different ways. I'm not really sure. I think, unfortunately, we're still, or at least I'm still fairly in shock. I would think it would worn off here, but still sort of pining for the good old days, or, of what is it, March of 2020 or whatever, But yeah, I certainly do think that in general, you're going to see, and that may change in terms of more conferences, that are going to be virtual, et cetera. I don't know if it'll change too much in terms of the actual practice of archaeology. What I mean by that is the actual digging. You still have a certain way you need to do things that someone needs to do. I don't see that, possibly changing. Like, it could be wrong. I could imagine drones and robots and things like that. But yeah, that's it's sort of a fuddling answer, but that's my answer to that question.
So yeah, what I would say in terms of the short term, of course, the big impact for me is I couldn't go do field work this summer, and next summer, most likely, we're probably not going to be able to do field work again, just because we don't know if there's going to be a vaccine. And of course, when I do archaeology, I dig very small archaeological sites. So I dig like houses that are a footprint of like maybe 5 feet by 5 feet, maybe a little bit bigger. These are small houses. And so to dig that, I have 20 students. And of course, they are in a 1 meter by 1 meter unit. They're all next to each other, shoulder to shoulder. The one thing you get from my field school usually is you get to know everyone else because you're right next to them 8 hours a day. So that's really hard for us to figure out how logistically to go forward with that. Although we have experimented with the idea of just taking fewer students, but it's still going to be a challenge, I think, to maintain social distance and wear masks and things, especially in the hot, humid Connecticut weather. But I think one of the positives that has come out of the short-term restrictions to fieldwork is that I think a lot of archaeologists are going back and finishing up projects that's been sitting on their desk, or going back to archaeological collections, museum collections, and start rewriting, writing new things about those collections. And I think that's a really important thing about museums, is that there's collections in there and we can keep rethinking them. You don't just write about them once, you write about them, one time, then 20 years later, someone rewrites it, rethinks it. Not to say that replaces everything that was written before, but I think that's a really important thing. And certainly for me, I spent a lot of time rethinking some of the older collections at the ROM this summer, and I have some projects coming out of that. So I think that's really good. I hope that Justin's right about the long-term impacts, and that someday we'll be able to get back to the broader goals that we still identify as very archaeological, how we work and how we do archaeology, going to do field work and such. But it's really hard to know at this point. But that's what I see. I tried to point out some good and some bad, to keep it mixed up.
So let's add, there's like I said, a number of questions. We won't be able to answer them all. We just have time for one last question, unfortunately. But once again, I'll blend a couple. And the question was really about the disconnect, sort of people saying, hey, look, there is sort of the perception from the public about what archaeology is and what archaeologists do. And the question was, well, and then there's the reality perhaps of, or at least what archaeologists are doing and what they think they're doing. And now one of the questions was sort of about theory and the disconnect between sort of theoretical approaches and the ways in which the public's perception, but more or less is that what a number of people have said is that they thought is that what people think we're up to may not be what we're up to, and how do we actually bridge that gap?
Yeah, I think one of the big problems that we face is kind of out of our hands in a way. It's actually popular media that depicts archaeology and archaeological heritage, like things that show up on the so-called History Channel. I think can be problematic because it leads off with these big mysterious questions, and I think it romanticizes what we do. So I think it's a difficult question because, of course, if I tell you exactly what my life is like as an archaeologist, you probably, if I tell you every single detail, you probably stop listening quite quickly. But I think there's room to have dialogue between the sort of the History Channel version of archaeology and like real archaeological lived experience. I think there's more room between dialogue between those. We don't have to oppose the two so much, but I think there has to be more room for archaeologists like us to talk about, the details, the minutiae of what we're finding and why we think it's really important. We're obviously very passionate, but of course, a lot of the journal articles and the books that we produce are aimed only at other archaeologists. So maybe it's about making our jobs so even more so public facing. So not only are we writing to our peers about the small problems that we have with our peers and that we want to work through, but also so have more public output. And I think that's why being a museum curator is really interesting, because of course that's part of our job, but that's not the part of all academic archaeologists' job. What do you think, Justin?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult nowadays because you do think, for example, back in the 1950s, you had Mortimer Wheeler to be on TV doing shows for the BBC and things like that. The part of you says, well, why can't we just do that? Why, that archaeologists should be out there in the public eye. The reality, I think you got at it a little bit, is that sometimes it's difficult because the practice of archaeology now, it's a slow process. You've got lots of little bits of data. Oftentimes, people are doing subspecialties about, say, isotopes or basionalis or something like that, that's hard even for archaeologists, to understand. I mean, I don't understand a lot of the archaeology that's being done, frankly, right? Because it's being done by these specialists, et cetera. So it's very hard to understand it all. But then nowadays, with in our our attention spans are getting shorter. Lots of things are happening. People want sort of the quick answer, while the science of archaeology makes these things longer and more equivocal. The answers that are being given. So it's a tension there that needs to be dealt with. But with that said, I do think that we can be a fairly inward gazing discipline. I also and then to some of the questions that were brought up, another disconnect between CRM and archaeology. There's a big disconnect there, right? Is that there's the bulk of folks, are not doing academic archaeology and are not, being given, and then their voices oftentimes are not being heard, except in a negative way sometimes, when there's conflict that are going on with some of these issues. So it's difficult. I do think, though, at the end of the day, especially at a place like the ROM, is that we're doing I think it's a lot of ways how we present objects, how we involve other groups, be they descent groups or other groups, about those objects, what they mean to them, because I'm oftentimes struck by the passion that people have about this stuff. Sometimes, like I said, sometimes they're not even descent groups. Sometimes it's something that just strikes someone as an artist or whatever it might be, and trying to get that passion, to show that care. Because I think that's the biggest thing for me, is that archaeology does matter to a lot of people, but we're not really getting those voices together in a unified manner in order to provide that support that I think the field would need in order to protect cultural heritage, look at some of these issues. And that's where I think in part is what we were hoping to do today, was say, hey, you throw any topic at us. We may not give you the best answer, but we can give you an answer for where archaeology might matter to this, that hopefully you hadn't thought about before, and hopefully be part of those dialogues, because that's where I think, to me, is the biggest, and I don't want to blather on here, but I think to me is the biggest thing that we have here, is that this sort of idea of like capitalism, this idea of modernity, this idea of a disconnect, that suddenly we're in this new era, this fundamentally different era, where all these other people, they're interesting, but they don't matter because they're so different from what is today. And at least for me, I'm saying no. I mean, first of all, that mentality is, of course, is divorcing lots of people from their past who keep think of their past, quite dearly. But also, I think, is divorcing us from a lot of notions about how to deal with all the questions that we raise and all the questions that people raise. Things like we talked about, the polarization, U.S. and Canada. We could talk about that. Protest movements. We can talk about a lot of different things, but in order to have that conversation, you actually have to value that past as being relevant and important to that conversation. And that's where I think we need to do a much better job of actually really pushing that. So I think that's it. I mean, I'll give you the last word, Craig, but I think we're done with all the questions. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in here, and I'll let Craig lead us out.
Well, I mean, I got to be honest with you here. That was the fastest hour that I've experienced in a very long time. I didn't realize that we're just out of time. But thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you again for our next curatorial conversation on November 11th. Details of all upcoming ROM at home online programs can be found at the ROM's website, and of course, check our social media channels: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone, and we'll look forward to our next one, November 11th. Thanks, Justin.
Bye, guys. Thank you.